were from a very, very liturgical environment.
And how often did you go with them to their?
I don't know. We went to church with them probably 3 or 4 times a year.
Okay.
But I also grew up in a neighborhood that was primarily Catholic. So a lot of my friends were in Catholic churches, and when I would go with them, it was just such a stark contrast from my church, which at the time was a non-denominational and was a very charismatic church. So to go from a charismatic church where there's literally dancing in the aisles and speaking in tongues to a church where we're sitting and standing and kneeling and sitting and standing and saying the same thing all together, the same thing week after week after week, that was just a complete disconnect for me. It was so impersonal, and I couldn't worship that way all the time. My grandfather does, and bless his heart, that's what he enjoys and that's what he wants. But for me, it doesn't work at all.
Okay.
It doesn't work
And
at all.
why do you suppose it doesn't work for you?
Because it takes me out of it. It just becomes the routine, and it just becomes doing what I have to do. It's like work. I hate.
Okay.
In fact, in my current job, I design things and I'm constantly creating new things. I have employees I hire people to do the stuff that gets the same thing gets done every day. Because that's, for some people, that's great. Vaughn, one of my employees, that he thrives on that. He is excellent at that. Me, I can't. If I do the same thing 4 times in a row, I'm falling asleep by the 5th time I do it. And I'm talking 1-minute job. If I have to do the same thing over and over again, for me, it does not work at all.
So what we would call routine or ritual in that sense doesn't appeal to some people. You would
Right.
say,
And for me, it definitely wouldn't appeal at all.
I was telling you how when I lived in Costa Rica, I went to a Catholic church. And when I was in Costa Rica, it was a very intense time in my life. One of my high school friends had just been shot. And then my best friend growing up, he was shot in a drug deal, gone bad. Then my step-grandpa died. Then my grandma, who was like, that grandma was your grandma, she passed away. And then my brother-in-law was killed in a tragic car accident. And I was, couldn't come home for any of it. And then on top of that, I had this teacher in my language studies who hated me. And every day he was just like, "You're so horrible. You'll never speak Spanish well. You're the worst student I've ever had." And so I was such an emotional wreck that there was actually so much comfort in going to the Catholic Church, knowing what was going to happen, knowing what I could expect, finding comfort in that routine. And I think that sometimes the routine is comforting when everything else in life is so chaotic and you don't know what's going to get thrown at you next, and you just feel there's something really special about going in knowing that we're going to say this and do this, and there's nothing unexpected. It was very comforting to me. I found a lot of comfort in the rituals of the Catholic.
And I think you mentioned in your email post how your children, you got them ritualized, so to speak, routines.
Yeah.
And what's wrong with routine? You brought that up.
Yeah. So routine is a lot of our lives, and I don't think we can become legalistic about it. I think that's probably one of the parts where it takes disconnects from our heart.
Right.
That if the Holy Spirit wants to intervene in that routine, are we willing to let Him?
Okay.
But I think that there's a great need sometimes in a world of chaos, in a world of unknowns, that there's great comfort. I think that's sometimes why it's so nice that you go to church and you're going to sing the song and you're going to take the offering, and sometimes that's comforting, to just go, I'm just going to come and I'm going to worship God, and it's not going to be chaos for me.
Right, and I guess my question, I get blah, 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 blah. What I was pushing was, why is it okay to make singing, offering, message ritualistic, but not the other stuff, the creeds, the sacraments? Why is it that they kind of get the stepchild treatment in the sense of, okay, we'll see you once a month, once a quarter, maybe once a year, but yet, the singing, we'll see you next week. The offerings, Lord forbid we don't take an offering, and Lord forbid you don't hear a message. I guess that's my question, is why is it that what we have now is sufficient, but yet if you try to add and say, the creeds on a weekly basis, or the sacrament on a weekly basis, why are you going to have so much push against that? If that clarifies.
Well, yeah, I understand perfectly. I was raised in a Methodist church, got saved in the Nazarene church. So I joined the Nazarene church to express my ministry, and I did that for 22 years. When we moved to Michigan to teach, I found, we wanted to go in our neighborhood, and I found a Presbyterian church. And when I went in there, it was just like going back home. And though I never joined, because I'm not a Calvinist, never have been, never will be probably, but it was like going home. And then when we moved into Dearborn, from the little town we lived in, eventually we settled in what's called a mega church, which was a evangelical Presbyterian church in Northville, Michigan. And loved it. Loved the routine, absolutely. Loved the quality of it. I loved everything about it. And I think that's one of the things when we're talking about ritual and routine. The other thing the direction of the question though was about doctrine and the necessity for what we're looking at in terms of, and I think that's, Brad, in a way is where you were going with that, what the necessity of maintaining some form or some way to keep the doctrine on track.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit of what our reading was about, how do we keep these things? Because you saw all the errors that were cropping up. Any speculation why these errors were cropping up? Did you want to go there with that?
I think it was just the fact that there was no unified thought at the time. Until you start having the councils and that they're coming together to say, hey, this is what we are going to believe, you're able to just have anyone pop up and be like, you know what, this is what I see. This is how I interpret the scriptures. This is how I interpret that letter. And I think until you have your councils and you're coming together to really form what you're going to believe, it's so easy just to pop up and just throw whatever you want out.
Maybe go back to Chrislam and what's happening with Rick Warren right now, and I don't know.
I saw that on the post. I wasn't.
Yeah, I hadn't even known anything about that.
Further, follow that up. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, and let's see, I don't know if this is true. I was looking up, everything's true on the internet, so. But I guess that there was a report that he was lining up with the Muslim community within California there, and that they were going to join alliances and try to doctrinally say that Allah there are aspects of Allah that are like our God. And so because of that, people have come out against that, and then also I think his inauguration prayer or whatever, they were coming out against that too, because he spoke, I don't think he called Jesus Jesus or something, but I could be wrong on that. So, and so it kind of, I see the same thing happening today in so many ways. People just,
The coexist bumper sticker.
yeah. So.
Well, there's a lot of things going on. We're confronted with pluralism in our day, and that not that 80% of Christians in America will hold to belief in God and pretty much hold to their understanding of who God is and what the church is about. Not all of those are what we would call practicing evangelicals by any stretch of the imagination. But then there's this strong, and I'm going to call it a minority movement, but has a loud voice. You know how it is in a classroom. Kid that screams the loudest gets the most attention, or in your family. And in a sense, pluralism is being trumpeted from the media and certainly liberal government ideas and all. I'm not against the idea of trying to have dialogue and understanding. So Chrislam, which I don't understand, and one of our other students had made comment to that as well, if you remember, she responded to you. the idea of dialogue, and I teach world religion, so I try to be appreciative of trying to understand where other people are coming from. There are contributions both within the context of Christianity worldwide, as well as within world religions, that are, their contribution comes from their context. And context often dictates the way we come out believing certain things. Give you a good example, within the Church of the Nazarene 50 years ago, my wife went to International Nazarene Youth Congress, or International Institute, I think we were calling it then, in Estes Park, Colorado. Now, she comes from the Midwest, she comes from Central Ohio, she comes from a little, I call it, forgive me out there, Kentucky church in Upper Sandusky, Ohio. And she had a very narrow idea of what the Nazarene Church was about. And her pastor was one of these strict, by the rule, you know, this is outlawed, this is outlawed, this is outlawed. Matter of fact, she was committing sin by dating me, and I wasn't a so-called, you know, born-again Christian yet. So not a Nazarene by any means either, so that was a sin. So anyway, she had gone out there, and she saw a whole new world of Nazarene-dom that she had never seen before, because suddenly she had East Coast, West Coast kids coming to International Institute. Now, mind you, on the bus out, now again, 50 years ago, the pastor said, you're not to drink pop in a bottle. We don't want them to think you're drinking beer. So on the bus, they couldn't drink pop out of a bottle. They didn't want them to play cards, even though it was rook, because they feared that someone in a car down here could see in a bus up here and see them playing cards and think that they were playing with a deck of real cards. So you see how far the church has come since then. But I say that because when she saw West Coast Nazarene girls, she didn't even believe they were Nazarene. Because they had their ears pierced, they had makeup on, they were wearing shorter skirts, and you know, and things were really, you know, topsy-turvy for her when she began to see another world. And when we went out to Olivet, after we got married, I took her out to Olivet, that world was challenged again by the whole diversity of the educational zone. So well, I say all that as an illustration to point out that regions and areas have different ideas about how Christianity looks or how we should be believing. The Eastern Church has always had a different understanding than the Western Church. The Nicene Creed, it's really practiced in song and in ritual regularly within the Eastern Church. That's why I was hoping that if you started looking at some of the dress and traditions of the Eastern Church, you begin to see, wow, this is what it's really looking like. They've held on to tradition. Talk about tradition. Comes out of that old Constantinople, that old Roman Empire, that whole idea that came down from Constantine in the 400s. So when you begin to see things, from a different cultural view, wow, what perspective do they have that I don't have? And that's what I can appreciate about the idea of diversity in religious thought, diversity of opinion, pluralism, if you want to use that particular word. Because sometimes we get so myopic that we think we're the only ones who got the right view. And suddenly we begin to realize we don't. I don't know how many times, we kept feeling for the longest time years ago when the church was a lot more restrictive in the way it used to teach and preach. Couldn't believe anybody else but us were getting into heaven. They used to say that about the Baptists too, Paul.
No.
Don't you, I mean, there is truth to the idea that when you disconnect yourself from history and you don't know who you are and you don't know where you've come from, then that's folly, because it's not even a point of repeating it, but you aren't going to learn those lessons. It's every great tragedy in history comes because people have disconnected themselves from who they are, you know? And so if we as Christians don't see if we don't need to know all of this, and we don't need to know the history of the church, and we don't need to know about these founding fathers, then why even study the Bible?
Yeah.
Why do we need the Old Testament at all?
Yeah.
You know, because it connects us to the whole story of God, and that whole story of God didn't stop at Revelations. It kept going because the people of God kept going. And you know, I think that when we forget that, we lose who we are. And I think that's an issue in the Church of the Nazarene, is that we've lost a bit of who we are.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and so, you know, that's why I think that part of me really enjoys this conclave process, because there's something so rich about hundreds of years, them doing this and this and then this and then this, you know, and there's something really redeeming about connecting to that past and connecting to those traditions.
Well, one of the things that you'll see next week as you start reading into the Reformation, which now that week is open for you to start viewing, you're going to see that as we progress along, that when Luther came in, he came in kind of bombastically and, you know, and throw everything out, you know, and start almost like we start new. And then you get into the whole idea of purging churches and iconoclasticism, where you have the destruction of images and paintings and icons and everything. And even during the period of the Puritan takeover of England, during what we call the Civil War, following the death of Charles I, the Puritan reformers went through there, and they were blasting. They had their guns. They go into churches and blast out the stained glass windows because they had pictures of the saints on them. And here's this history just blown away in that moment, and we're standing now 500 years or 400 years from that, and we're looking back and saying, boy, they were a bunch of idiots, weren't they? So I wonder, at times when we look back on some of our denominational divisions, if we wouldn't begin to say, they weren't too smart about what they were doing. They kind of got real myopic and only saw themselves. Now, one of the things you will see in reform movements, and I know I'm jumping ahead to reform movements here, away from our basic discussion about doctrinal purity, but I think it all kind of works into that, because doctrinal purity, or maintaining doctrine, or the right interpretation of doctrine, is one of the main reasons that you have splinter groups, sects starting off of the main lines of churches, because they have a different idea how this doctrine ought to be interpreted. It goes back to our own denomination, the Church of the Nazarene. They pulled out Methodism because they didn't like the way the Methodists were fighting against what they considered to be the doctrine and concern about the second definite work of grace that they felt Wesley was teaching. Now, when we watch this happen, you will see that there will be an effort to move forward to purify the doctrine again, to get back to basics, to get back to a proper interpretation. And when that happens, there's a lot of traditions that are thrown out. Luther threw out all kinds, and one of the first things he threw out was church tradition. But at the same time, Catholic Church had elevated to the point of power and corruption, which you should be starting to look into this week as we're getting into looking at that idea of how the church is being corrupted. So as we get into understanding the corruption, particularly during the Middle Ages, power begets power. And those who have it begin to want to hold on to it, and they want to pull it into themselves. And the church, as we will see, begins to get mighty, powerful, becomes another nation, as it were. laying alongside the other nations that were in existence. And we're going to look at that tonight. And you've been reading about it, but we're going to talk about it tonight, how this begins to happen within the context of a church. How does it begin to happen within the context of the Catholic Church, and particularly in the West? It's not a problem in the East, but it's definitely a problem in the West. So we're going to look at that tonight. All right, well, that's going to kind of start us out. Any other housekeeping questions or anything else we need to deal with?